Welcome. The first order of business, Walt Custer tells me, is to ask you to put your cell phones on silent mode or turn them off. So if you take just a minute to do that, it will improve the experience of everyone, so thank you. Welcome to the Once and Future Sea Ranch, an architectural forum in honor of the Sea Ranch's 50th birthday. We welcome all of you in the audience here at our historic and beautiful barn, as well as those in the audience for our broadcast at the Del Mar Center. We actually have about another 100 or so people at Del Mar watching via simulcast, and everyone joining us via our remote audio-visual broadcast. And I'd just like to thank Peter, Jenny, and others for helping make that possible. Please know that the Sea Ranch Association is recording this event. Your participation may be included in photographs, videotapes, or recordings, and may appear in public communications. Through your presence and participation, you are consenting to this use. Fair warning for the question period. Rather than listing by name all the many organizations and people I ought to thank for helping to make today's events possible, I refer you to the back page of our program brochure. There are two names, however, that do not appear there. I'd like to publicly thank now Carol Emery and Janice Benora, both of whom have been indispensable. So a little hand for them. Warm thanks too to my Architectural Forum Committee and to all who helped make today's program possible. Practical matters. Accessible restrooms, two of them, are available behind me in that corner. We can get there on either side. And in the Olson Ranch House across the way, those are accessible restrooms. There are also porta potties in front of the barn, just outside here. We have bottled water available, but I also want to point out the drinking fountain towards the front on your left. Sea Ranch water is better than what comes in bottles, so run out for a sec. Presenting an event like this at the barn is a challenge. Don't be surprised if there is a technical glitch or two. We'll do what we can to make this an enjoyable as well as a worthwhile experience for everyone. Today's program is outlined in your program brochure. 6 speakers will be followed by a panel discussion and then audience questions. In February, the association will be organizing a member workshop where we can integrate our speakers' thinking into our own. Therefore, today, I will ask you to frame your remarks as questions to the panel. Our first speaker is our own living treasure, Donlyn Lyndon, Professor Emeritus of Architecture and Urban Design at UC Berkeley. Donlyn has headed departments of architecture at MIT and at the University of Oregon. His design work includes the Sea Ranch's historic Condominium 1. Recently, Donlyn has devoted a great deal of his time to chairing our Commons Landscape Committee, a collaborative effort to manage 10 challenging miles of coastal and forest landscape here at the Sea Ranch. He is the author of many books on modern and contemporary architecture. His most recent book is an expanded edition of the Sea Ranch, 50 Years of Architecture, Landscape, Place, and Community on the Northern California Coast. Please join me in welcoming and thanking Donlyn Lyndon.
What a wonderful day. What a chance to look out at many friends. Can't quite see them all, but and to find this kind of interest and excitement about the Sea Ranch and its architecture and what its beginnings and its current status and its future might be. I was charged with giving a kind of pocket history. I'm an architect, so most of the history is in my architectural pocket. There are other things that are obviously contributing to the character of the Sea Ranch, including a number of disputes with jurisdictions, which I won't go into. There'll be plenty of people who understand about all that. The people we have coming and speaking the rest of the day will be making observations about the context in which the Sea Ranch happened, and they'll be giving us some comments and advice about where it might go from here. I will leave much of that until the panel, when I'll correct them all. Let me first find the pointer, right? In setting out to talk, oh, I'm supposed to point there, not there, right? Okay, no? Well, you were told to expect some glitches. Is there an on switch, John? The last glitch that's going to happen today. Oh, thank you. The first starting point for the initiation of the Sea Ranch were obviously the conditions of the site itself. This spectacular coastline, extremely rugged and rough. In the photograph on the right, the product of eons of geological struggle. And on the left, what we perceived mostly when we first came. The forest that was off most of the property. The property, as you all, not all, but probably most of you know, was 10 miles long, approximately, and at its widest about a mile deep. So it included a big chunk of that forest, but the dominant characteristic was the meadows, and what was actually called by the initial people who came to this area, prairie. Just this long, uninterrupted grasses that had developed, and then the hedgerows marking them into rooms, basically, big rooms we saw them as. Windbreaks we saw them as, primarily. We thought first that they had all been put there to block the very fierce wind. But we've been corrected on that, and it was also that the rancher was trying to make it into subdividable parcels. We took a cue from that, not knowing that, we took the cue from the hedgerows nonetheless, as an organizing principle for how the Sea Ranch could become. Now, who's we? The initiator was Al Bokie. And Al, the story, you probably all know about flying over the coast and seeing it and coming down and talking to the ranchers and knowing this was available. He was looking to build a new town for oceanic properties. It wasn't a very likely place for a new town given the transportation context, but he decided that it would be, having fallen in love with the land, decided it would become a great second home community. So he set about persuading his board to do that, and they endorsed the idea, and then he set about assembling a team to make that happen. Before I move on, one of the things that emerged from the team that he assembled and the thinking about it was a kind of ethos or an idea about what this place amounted to and could become. And that was, I think, brilliantly encapsulated by Barbara Stoffel Solomon, now Solomon, in the logo that I see some of you are wearing, and which has been the mark for the Sea Ranch. I say it's encapsulated because obviously there's the ram's head, the sheep ranch. Obviously there are the nautilus shells, the the sea and the natural process that evolves in a complex and spiraling way. And people tend to forget this, a very precise discipline in the making of it, making it with a really clear discipline of the shaping without a lot of sort of peripheral things added to it. That's an important part of the image of what was first intended for the Sea Ranch. I'm still not getting this to work right. There we go, right. The first thing and most important thing that Al did is to hire Larry Halpern to lead the team. He had worked with Larry before. Larry was already well understood to be one of the leading landscape architects and planners in the country. This photograph was taken actually about 30 years ago. Not when we were starting, but about 30 years ago, actually at the memorial for Charles Moore. But Larry was here. He took a place on the Sea Ranch. He spent lots and lots of time here throughout his life, and he was a person who articulated the vision most powerfully, in part with his drawings, and he was someone who actually spent all of his time here making drawings and studying the place. And these are just a couple from an exhibit of his work, but there are many, and you'll see more today. These are two of the diagrams that he made, which are essential to understanding what we were about. The one, the spiral at the top, is reminding us that we are here at the end of a very long spiral of evolution, and it isn't just our ideas which are going to make this place. It's engaging with all of that history, all of that prior development, which has spiraled out of deep time into our present. The time scale is such that, time scale is, time scale is such that our period is right down there at the bottom. The other diagram, which is so important, was what he called the locational score. And Larry and we're working in part with Anna as well as others, had come to the idea of developing not just plans but scores. Scores that identify, what was important about the idea of the scores, that identified what you were wanting to do. And it was likened to a score of music, which is interpreted by musicians who play it differently than maybe you even first intended. But it gives an idea about where to go. And so this was full of instructions about the big principles about where to go. Some of it diagrams things that didn't ever happen. Some of it, like the condominium up on the hill over there, or the great big meadow along Annapolis Road. But some of it, but the fundamental principles are there: the edge of the forest, the incredible coastal bluff, the hedgerows marking out the prairie, as it were, and the coast going through, and putting houses back into the trees, and keeping the meadows open. All those things became absolutely central to how we think about this place. There were other diagrams. The notion that what was so important, again, is that architecture and landscape were seen together. It wasn't that there was a plot made and then you put things down on it. It was that they were to be seen as ways of relating to each other, clusters of houses and clusters of clusters of trees, vegetation. And it was, unlike many plans, it was seen three-dimensionally. It was understood to be a three-dimensional phenomenon, not just a set of lines denoting properties on a page. There was also then a lot of study of what were the conditions of this site beyond the geology. I'm sorry. There's a little delay on this thing. But the climate was fierce. When we first met with the geographer who had been assembled as part of the team, he said that the average wind speed on the site, the average wind speed was 15 miles an hour. Now that was out on our condominium site, which was out on a point at the end, and not back against the hedges. But it's different now. It's different now because there's been so much development, so many more trees, so many more buildings, that has been paced down. But it's still, you haven't, our visitors haven't experienced the wind here, unfortunately. But then the architecture was to perform within that context. So the architecture was to reach up to the sun, and the bioclimatic chart showed that you almost always welcomed sun here. It was, they were dipping down into the wind, they're making wind shelter places. Again, these things were working together to become a form. And then that got translated most directly into the houses on top, what we call the hedgerow houses. And then there was the team. On the left is, what's going on here? On the left is Joseph Eschrich, again about maybe 30 years ago, which is to say 20 years after this was happening. And he was very well established and recognized architect in the Bay region. And then there was this goofy group, MLTW, which was newly minted and worked collaboratively around tables all the time. And then another vital partner was Matthew Sylvia, who was the contractor brought from Southern California by Oceanic, who had actually worked for Neutra as a foreman. Here shown with Bill Turnbull on Matt's 50th birthday party, I'm told. These photographs, by the way, were taken by Reverdy Johnson, who many of you know, who was also a very brilliant legal counsel for Oceanic at that point. So that was the team that's first started out working. Joe is shown singular here, but he was Joseph Eschrich and Associates, and Peter Dodge and Chuck Davis, who were two of those associates, are here in the audience today too. As is Richard Carlisle, I believe, who is with Barelgi and Race, which was a civil engineering firm. So here was an idea of what we were about. This is Bill Turnbull's beautiful drawing of that same landscape, and you can see the forest and the forest coming down in certain places, and then the rooms of the hedgerows, condominiums up on the hill, condominiums down below, more than the one condominium one, and the hedgerow houses showing over right in here, and then others intended along the other hedgerows, yeah. And the marker building with the logo on it, right here. When we first started, when we worked on the condominium and built the condominium, Eschrich was hired to do the first store and then the hedgerow houses and the marker building here, and we were hired to do the condominium. It's important to remember that when this was done, there wasn't a tree in sight. There's some brush up here on the hill. If you are familiar with the place now, it's enshrouded. Well, you can see in some sense how it's enshrouded there and how it's interconnected here. We wanted to have something that was kind of big in the landscape like farm buildings. We didn't want to make it look like a barn. That's always a mistake people make. It was to use the forces of the site and use the construction of the timbers that was native to the place, and to get it then into a big, large structure that would rise with the land, would actually just sit on the land. You can see that the bottom section has the framing stepping just with the volume step with the actual form of the ground. And then it would then have this big form that would be recognizable from a distance and would, we thought, be an appropriate part of farm environment. It also just happened to have that little tower piece on the end. And then within that structure, which became a kind of inner landscape, a volume that was full of incident and light and framing. We had a great structural engineer who was willing to track down all those diagonal forces. It had what we call an edicula. Actually, it's an old term from historic architecture, ancient historic architecture, all the way through history, really, of a place that is small and around you, and something intimate to be in. And then we wanted to make such a thing here with the canopy up above. This became not a four-poster, but a four-poster bedroom. And then here, the other piece that was inside that volume was a collection of the machines of the thing, the sinks, the toilets, the bathing, and so on. So it was trying to use all those elements in a direct way, and with materials that were related to the place. Every time this is what the inside looked. This is a photograph from when it was recently completed. Classic Morley Bear photograph, which has been seen around the world. It was meant to, it already had started receiving, this was Charles Moore's own unit, had already started receiving his various family items and objects of attention. They were meant to do that. They were meant to be places that had an inner structure, that had a kind of liveliness in the space itself, but then got elaborated and filled with things that were of people's choice. In the case of Charles, that happened with some exuberance, and continued to happen. He kept changing paint colors and so on. But it had still always this quality of having an intimate place, and then a bench, bay window that's in the edge of the outdoors, and then the outdoors beyond. And that transition from an inner thing to a transitional to the outdoors was seen as crucial to thinking about the place. That then was the scheme. That unit is this one right here. I also had a little glass box room here. Then that basic scheme was repeated 9 times, and the four-poster was in that 7 of those 9 times. But what was really important is that every one of these, they staggered to have different kinds of corners and outlook, and every one of those had a special, different way of relating to the outside. So this was something where there was both the sense of the larger pattern and that it also framed a courtyard which belonged to all of them. So the natural landscape went down through that was important. And this is the view you can have now of it from Byler Point, and it shows the large form that developed, and then those little adjustments. And it actually is sometimes referred to as being like the cliff top itself, with all those sort of bumps and grinds and adjustments that happen from nature happening in the building, and that's what we wanted. We wanted this to be a building that had big power and had also the adjustments that were characteristic of how vegetation relates to the landscape, how the landscape itself is formed. All right, well, I've dwelled on that a little bit because it was a sort of fundamental set of principles we were working with. That also had, and this one takes time to load sometimes, a plan for, Oceanic asked us to make a plan for 80 of these, and those were 10. And it proceeded, John, that was showing the other day. Can you go back? I don't know why it isn't coming up today. Anyway, what we did with that extended plan, I'm terribly sorry it's not showing, is that it was always reaching around the landforms. It was always following the landforms and making 8 separate clusters, each which had its own carport, each which had its own collective space. We have to pass on that, I guess.
Give me a second now.
Oh, magic. But maybe not. Maybe we just have to go on. Imagine it in the way I just described. Because actually that's the only thing you can do. Because the developers abandoned that condominium plan. There were, in fact, in the plans that were initially prepared for the whole of the Sea Ranch, the whole 10 miles, there were a number of condominium sites. And the idea was to have that kind of set of relationships throughout the Sea Ranch in different places. They tended to be in prominent places, condominium law was new when we first built that, and later it became known for condominium law as a way of getting schlock development. And I can hear the argument now when they were asked to cut back on the number of units. It was, well, we'll get rid of those nasty condominiums. So they went into the file drawers and actually became invisible. Look at that. The other project that was part of the initiation, and I must rush much more, is were the hedgerow houses that Joseph Escherick and Associates did. And this is an early photograph of them, and you can see the hedgerow, and you can see the buildings related to it. Here is what it's like today. That there's these wonderful houses which are set down low into the ground a little bit, reaching up towards the hedgerow, sheltering the back with little courtyards in the back for more stuff to grow. More stuff took the advantage to grow. So now these buildings are really absorbed completely into the landscape, and that was the intention, that these should become a part of what landscape was already there, whereas in our case it was kind of making a piece of landscape. Next, let's see. Well, there's how they're situated in a large meadow. This we have come to call the Sea Ranch Meadow, because it was the original planning idea of Larry's that the houses would be related to the hedgerows and the middle would be kept open. And there would not be something across that would block other people's views. So everybody along here had the opportunity to look across and through that meadow and down towards the ocean. Another element at that time was the Moonraker Athletic Club. And that again was an integration of land and building. And it was very earth berms used to settle this athletic club into the land. And then that wall along one side, which then became rooms inside for the lockers. And then those little tiny lockers became expansive with the kind of wild super graphics that Bobby Suffolk and Salmon did again. And that was characteristic of what we were trying to do, is to make something that would be a part of something more, as you saw in the larger landscape, and then would have incredible vibrancy when you actually were a part of it. So that's the initial set. The first individual building, built by an individual, that is to say, as opposed to Oceanic, is Reverdy Johnson's house. Reverdy being the lawyer I spoke of before, who wrote the CC&Rs and who actually also encapsulated the design rules. And it is one that takes a really little house form, pyramidal form. If you look carefully, you'll see it's not just simple. It bends down farther on one side than the other and so on. And then inside was, again, a completely different environment. It was much brighter at the time than it has been, as it's now been made. I don't know if this is the present state, but a few years ago. But it was a wonderful little house, sitting on the edge of the forest. Here, by 1972, is what had happened. There was one little piece of condominium that was done. Then there was another set of things, the barn, Binker Barn, which is to be repeated in many places and was, it's really good. And then the cluster houses, which Turnbull did the original designs for, they were a little bit modulated by the developer, which made a big gathering up on the hills, again on the edge of the forest, and another cluster set, which Bill did carry through all the way, which has this wonderful way of modulating in relationship to the edge of the forest. Because of, again, two types which are taken and then adjusted to show the variety of what's there. This is the employee housing, and is also one of the most celebrated buildings at the Sea Ranch, set of buildings at the Sea Ranch. Again, a vernacular form used very ingeniously in the site planning. Many, many different conditions, which we're now trying to come to grips with, that we need. The Commons Landscape Committee has been working on trying to understand all the different kinds of things that go into that landscape, and recognizing that it needs a kind of stewardship, making analyses of what the form is. This drawing shows you clearly what's private property and what's commons. The private property is the lighter version, not quite so clear down. But the parts that we've been looking at are down at the very bottom of that, just one corner of that. And then we did, with workshops, we came to 50 recommendations of things that needed to happen to keep that commons working properly. But what's most interesting is to think about this as a joint stewardship of 10 miles of coast, partly by the association on the commons and partly by individual owners. And so you can see how much of the Sea Ranch there is. The part we've been looking at is right here. It's a lot of stuff. But I will just rapidly fire through a bunch of houses that are ones that, for the most part, are doing well at that stewardship, like these, which are actually edging the meadow in a good way, or this one where there are two houses that are actually relating very much to each other against the hedgerow. And then this flash through, because I'm running out of time. I am run out of time. Another factor now there's a lot of vegetation has grown. Most especially, a lot of it is what we call riparian, that's following the drainage ways and creeks, and has a different quality than the cypress hedgerows, which were laid out in regular lines. And so people are taking advantage of that as well. There are houses that go along the edge of the meadow, which one of the things that's happened is a dispute about whether things should become light or should become dark. I'm on the dark side. These buildings actually go along the road and then up on a higher terrace, because there's enough topography to make things change. Here are different kinds of planning that happen, not like the original. Here there's a very flat area which has got a set of fingers through the meadow. There isn't a big hedgerow between. On the other side is a layout that is partly historical and partly relating to landforms. There always are meadows that are pretty substantial. The last one was also was an example of one of the houses that Joe Escher did independent in between in the middle years. Which has this right down at the front of by the beach, and has this little place to go out, and then you get a trail and go out and deal with it. This wonderful house by Bill Turnbull and Charles Moore that does the marvelous thing of stepping aside. It makes a kind of quite a strong figurative claim, but then it steps aside so that these houses have a view across their lot. This is on one, like a third of their lot. And then the next house down did the same thing. It stepped over to the side, so this house can look off that way. That's the thing I wish we had a lot more of than we do. Here's a house that's connecting to the land in a very clear way. Here's a house that brackets the view, so that from the road you still have the opportunity. It's along the front of the coast, but it doesn't block it off. You still have a chance to see, because it's been divided into two pieces. This one, which captures a little piece of the meadow and has its form derived exactly from the place that it's in, and yet then has this nice kind of environment up above, made with the cast of how it's built. Here's one where the meadow is actually brought inside the house and slides on through the house, as it were, from this gate through the dining area and then on out, and the bluff is out here. And these sections show what's going on. It's very important what's happening in section with all of these. Here's something inhabiting the forest. This is in addition to an original house is there. And it's finding ways of looking out. Here's one which has been recently built. It's one of a number of these are within the last 10 years. This one is one which is very special in that it's up against the bluff cypress. Oops, up against the bluff cypress. And then it has a corten seal on the top and concrete walls matching into the ground, and then a whole plywood interior. So it's very carefully, interestingly crafted. Then there's this one, which is making a courtyard with a hedgerow at the far end, where there's mostly otherwise suburban development, and uses some cementitious materials as a panel. There's then this set, which I won't comment on, and it has embodied the business of windows being where they want to be, not because it's a facade pattern, which is essential to thinking about this place. This is Larry's diagram of his own site after 40 years. Lots of interest in the outdoors. It's a big site. He's got lots of outdoors to have an interest in. And then this beautiful house that was built for him, designed by Buzz Jewell, after the first house burned down, which Charles and Bill and Larry had worked on together. Here you come in the door, and there's that piece of natural form column, and then the outlook to the ocean, the little place to go sit in and have breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And here we are back at the barn. The barn is right here. The other athletic club is there between hedgerows. The historic Olson house is there. We are looking at a place where uncharacteristically there's a row of houses along the front, but then there are these clusters of terraces, and here are the other clusters that I talked about and showed you examples of. So it's a very varied landscape. There have been many good responses, I know. There have been many good responses to it. There are many more excellent houses than I've shown you. There are many more houses that are maybe not ones that I would have set out to show you as excellent. It's a very rich, complicated landscape with a very rich history of development. So thank you.
Thank you, Donlyn. That was a tough assignment, I now realize. Many of you may now, if you don't already have Donlyn's book, run out and buy it, because that and more is in it. Mitchell Schwarzer is an architectural and urban historian who serves as professor of visual studies at California College of the Arts in Oakland and San Francisco. He has also taught at the University of Illinois at Chicago and the Rhode Island School of Design. Mitchell edited Design Book Review from 1999 to 2001, and his own books include Architecture of the San Francisco Bay Area, His History and Guide. I learned a lot just from talking to Mitchell about the forum and what he might talk about, so I'm very much looking forward to what he has to say. Mitchell Schwarzer, welcome.
You all hear me, right? Thank you for having me here. It's a real pleasure. Thanks to Donlyn and Jackie and the hosts where we're staying, Jim Orenberg and James Seck. It's great to be here. I'd like to talk today about two words, community and resort, and somehow by the end of my talk, try to bring them closer together. within the context of Sea Ranch in particular. By community, I'm referring to the act of creating a new social arrangement in a new place. And this is, I think, kind of one of the intrinsic activities that has faced people coming to this continent, the settlers of the continent, ever since the Spanish and the English and others arrived in North America. How do we create a new world here? People were fleeing persecution for religious reasons. People were coming here for economic reasons, and they were trying to establish a new way of living amongst each other, a community. They were also, I would say, for the large part of that history, basing that idea of community upon economics, upon how are we going to make a living. And farming was the first, hunting for furs, mining were the first kinds of activities that Americans engaged in this community building process, followed by the establishment of larger cities, industrialization. And I think the word resort comes in to community when resort becomes, and by resort I'm referring to a lot of the kind of comments that Donlyn was making, a place where one goes not to make a living, a place where one goes not to kind of profit from the land in a kind of stark economic sense, but a place where one goes to actually develop a sense of community in relationship to land and people. And I think that's where I'd like to head toward. In starting off, I just wanted to say, I was thinking, how am I going to approach this topic? And I looked at various angles. One angle was history, to look at the region and the history of the region as it developed during the late 19th and 20th century as an agricultural zone and as a place of farming and development of barns and the like. Another angle I thought of was to look back to the contemporary period when Sea Ranch was being planned, the environment of the counterculture in Northern California. This is a shot of the Morning Star commune in Sonoma County and the Wheeler Ranch, another commune established in Sonoma County, both a little bit after Sea Ranch, but they were being planned through the middle 1960s. I also thought about looking at Sea Ranch through an architectural community and a place where this is the Weissenhof architectural demonstration housing in Stuttgart, Germany, that was built in the 1920s, and most of your famous modernist architects have, there's a Le Corbusier, there's a Gropius, there's a Mies, etc. This was a place to bring architects together to establish a sense of architectural community through the development of new creative ideas in design. And then I looked at a complex that postdates Sea Ranch by a few years, which is Seaside in Florida. And this kind of is more of the focus that I'd like to talk about, the background to places like Sea Ranch and to places like Seaside, which is the resort angle, okay? And Seaside is obviously it developed during the 1980s, a lot different than Sea Ranch, a much smaller site, a very different set of landforms, but at the same time, some very strong similarities. Master plan community, a set of strict guidelines on how architecture was to be designed and what kind of architectural impressions people were to get from the place. So let's go back a little to talk about how did resort come into conjunction with community. We really don't have a concept of resort communities until the middle part of the 20th century. And this is a photograph of a famous resort hotel in California, it's the Del Monte Hotel. It's no longer there. It was down by Monterey. It was one like the Coronado Hotel in San Diego. It was part of the 1880s, part of the era of building grand hotels. This hotel, contained outside of it a racetrack, a polo field, a golf course, manicured gardens, a whole set of activities. And the resort hotel, I think, is the kind of genesis for the resort community, because resort hotels were places people went, often for long periods of time, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months, and where they engaged in activities that were distinct from their everyday lives. They learned how to resort or recreate. And at a place like this in the 19th century, recreating meant getting dressed up for 4 o'clock tea. It meant going to formal dinners. It meant taking walks through the gardens. And then it meant an escalating number of activities, like watching horses run and making bets on them, and swimming and golfing and the like. The resort hotel is the outgrowth of hotels in resort areas that started all the way back in the late 18th century and really developed through the 19th century. First, not to recreate. The reason people went originally to resort hotels was to actually go to improve your health, it was a hygienic idea that if you were in a place with great wind and good air, you would get healthier. That if you're in a place with mineral waters, you could get healthier. So the origins of the idea, and I think this will actually turn around to Sea Ranch somewhat, were very much connected to the idea of bettering oneself through a healthy atmosphere that could only be obtained in rural areas. So that was the original impetus. By the time you get to the late 19th century, these places are getting much more complex. And another big development has happened in the early 19th century, which I think is fundamental for Sea Ranch. The Romantic movement in both Germany and particularly in England, where for the first time there's a desire now to go to natural places as a way of uplifting oneself. That by going to the mountains and climbing into the snow zone, you can actually realize new aspects of your humanity. By going deep into caves, by hiking through forests. And this is what the Romantics were doing through the late 18th and early part of the 19th century. They were developing a rapport with nature, and in particular, they really developed the kind of criteria or the aesthetics of what does it mean to look at a view and enjoy a view and contemplate a landscape. These are things people really never did before or thought about before. I would say during that whole period of community building in America, from agriculture into industry, land is really seen as something you make your living from, you profit from, but you don't contemplate it in a kind of disinterested way. It took the development of Romantic aesthetics to give us a sense of, wow, we can actually develop ourselves as humans by contemplating the land in a new kind of way. Another real big aspect, around the middle part of the 20th century, there's a couple of developments, I think, that start to coalesce that take the resort hotel into the resort community. One is a general increase in affluence. The United States enjoys an amazing affluence after the Second World War. To give you one example, 40% of the world economy was in the United States in 1945. 40%. Because all the other major countries had been, industrial powers had basically been destroyed or totally fatigued by the war. So there's this incredible wealth. Now we're down to 20%, by the way, about 19 or 20. So it counts for a lot of the transitions that have happened since the war. But this is an extremely wealthy country, and people are having more money, they're having more leisure, desire for non-work activities, and they also have the means to get to them because we're building highways like we never did before after the Second World War, ways to get to nature. The way in the 19th century you'd have gone to nature by rail. Now you can get to nature by automobile, and this is a shot of Hawaii, the Ka'anapali Beach, that was the whole stretch, 2.5-mile stretch of beach coast on the island of Maui was taken by a single company and designed as a series of resort hotels. This is still a resort hotel, but I show the image because these were resort hotels that were designed from a master plan. They each had the same, about a 10-acre lot, so there are about 12 10-acre lots arranged along the beach, and each of them designed all of their improvements and services, the hotel, the rapport with the beach, in a kind of coordinated fashion. So what you get after the Second World War and by the 1950s and afterward is the coming together of this possibility, well, we can get to these places by air travel, by automotive travel, and because of the affluence, you get a new phenomenon. Middle-class ownership of second homes, which was really minuscule up until this point. And it goes, you know, it goes from some 150,000 Americans owned second homes, you know, in the 1920s, to 2.5 million, 3 million by the 70s and 1980s. So second home ownership becomes a phenomenon in America, and the confluence of the hotel and second home ownership develop, I think, the key ingredients for what becomes a resort community. One of the first important resort communities is the Sea Pines Plantation in South Carolina, which is a similar size. I think it's about 4,200 acres in South Carolina. Built a single company like Oceanic, took the property, developed a master plan, and created here you can see there's a town center and marina. It's built on the coastline, so there was an intention to protecting the coastline and not building houses right on the coastline at Sea Pines. They did, however, build a golf course right on the coastline, so it's a little bit different. But here's a view of the planning. And the idea was to take the entire site and to preserve most of it as nature, to cluster the houses in certain zones, to create that town center and marina, to have the golf course wrap mostly away from the water, and preserve large areas of marshes and forest land within the community. So this is a place that it contains actually, there is lodging, but it's mostly second homes, condominiums, and single-family homes, 1958. So it's a little bit earlier than Sea Ranch. And what I wanted to talk about in a little more depth were two communities in particular in California. This is this is leading up to that. This is the Smoke Tree Ranch down in, it's in Palm Springs, 1938. And it's the first, it's a planned community of homes, single-family homes, on about, I think it's about 80 acres. And one of the guidelines, there's a set of design guidelines that you had to build your homes within a desert landscape, that you couldn't just eradicate the desert landscape and put in a different landscape, that you would want to live in the landscape as it had existed for a long time. Walt Disney had a home here, and a lot of other celebrities. It became a kind of a famous resort. And it led up to one of the two, what I think, critical predecessors of Sea Ranch. One is the Thunderbird Country Club, which was the first, I would say, golf course community in the United States. Like a community designed around a golf course. So very different than Sea Ranch, but still a kind of parallel development. The idea that you'll have a community, in fact, you see the estate sites, and here's a view of the hotel. This is like the club and restaurant designed by William Cody. So there were architects involved in the design of the Thunderbird Country Club. This is where the car comes from, the Thunderbird car. This is where they invented the golf cart. It's very different than Sea Ranch. This is where they had the Bob Hope Classic. In fact, Bob Hope had a home here, Bing Crosby had a home, Lucy and Desi had a home here. So this is very much about celebrity. But it's the first. It's the first 18-hole golf course community in California. I think one of the first anywhere. Because the homes, the sale of the lots, financed the golf course. So there was a real estate formula that was developed here. There are now 97 golf course communities in the Coachella Valley alone. Just that big zone from Palm Springs out to Rancho Mirage. 97 of these communities. This is the first one. And the idea was here that you could, how do you create a community? Well, the idea was you create a community by bringing people together around common interests. And the common interest here, there's a wonderful swimming pool, and there's this great golf course. And this is a view of, this is the kind of house you would have. You'd have a house on the golf course, and you'd look out at the golf course. And in fact, in reading accounts of it, people talk about how they would stop at their own house and have drinks during their game and then continue on. And this is just wonderful. They just love doing this. Here's another view of the golf course, and that's actually a view from Gerald Ford's home, because Gerald Ford, ex-president, bought a home at Thunderbird, and because this is a place where people bought homes there. of his stature. And he, you know, there's his little chairs, and you just look out at the golf course. You look out at this created environment. And I think one of the similarities of Thunderbird to Sea Ranch, in addition to the home ownership, in addition to finding a community, was figuring out a way to shape land in relationship to that community. The shaping of the golf course, and then the other example I'd like to show you is Squaw Valley, 1960 Olympics, which inaugurates an amazing thing, right? Olympics in California, in a town that there's no town even. It was just a small, tiny ski resort in 1955 when it was chosen over Innsbruck and St. Moritz, which is kind of amazing. And here's one image of it. And what resulted around Squaw Valley were the creation of ski resort communities. And this is one of them. This is the first condominium ski resort community in the world, in the United States. It's called Tahoe Tavern. It was designed by Henrik Bull, who's a noted Northern California architect. And it contains a lot of the kind of key elements, you know, the set of tennis courts, a pool, and then clustered complexes. It's again the idea of a master plan for an entire community, in this case, bringing people together around skiing up at Tahoe, but then in the summertime recreating along the lake. And there's a shot of some of the condominiums along Lake Tahoe. So the idea of having a golf course community, a ski ranch community, a ski community, what are the elements, okay? What will bring people to a place? Like they're not going to be moving to this place to make money or to get a job. They're moving to this place perhaps to retire or perhaps as a second home. What will bring them there? How will they develop a community together? And I would say if you look at resort communities around the world, they really follow these models. They really follow the model of intense recreation. You have a lot of recreational activities, golf courses, swimming pools, tennis courts, a lake to swim, ideally in the case of Tahoe, a ski resort. And then this is one shot of some of the houses that Henrik Bull did. This is the Knosson house he designed for one of the developers of Squaw Valley. I won't go into the details, but there's a lot of similarities too in the attention to how do you design a house in ski country, very much like what Donlyn was talking about, how do you design a house on the California coast. And there's a shot of Sea Ranch. Now what makes Sea Ranch different? Obviously, right away, there is a golf course. There's a little view of the golf course, and you know, from what I've heard, it started in the 70s as a 9-hole course and was not didn't become an 18-hole course until the mid-1990s. So obviously golf was not luring people here. There are a couple of swimming pools. We had seen some shots of one. Here's the one right next to us. But the swimming, were people coming here primarily for swimming? Probably not, given the temperatures and the winds, which we still haven't experienced. Here's a view of Larry Halpern's plan. And what I would argue, and what I'd like to close in my closing comments I'd like to make, is that I think what brought people to Sea Ranch, and here's one of the hedgerow houses, the idea of looking at the houses from the meadow, as we heard earlier, and then the view up from the house of both the meadows and the ocean. I think it's this idea of aesthetic contemplation. The idea that Sea Ranch almost intentionally has very little to do. It's not a place you're showered with activities. I don't think there's a zip line here yet. So people are coming here. This is kind of what I would characterize it as the kind of romantic resort community in that tradition of romantic aesthetics. People are coming here to find themselves and to relate to other people in a communal act of appreciating land and contemplating land. And in that act, I'd like to close with one. I was thinking, well, this must have been happening before. This Sea Ranch can't be the first place that people did this. And I thought back to one of my the people who've inspired me my whole life, the composer Gustav Mahler. And I lived in Austria, and I got to know lots of Austrians. And Austrians, habitually, they live in a big city like Vienna, but they go to the country as often as they can. And Mahler was no exception. And this is, so we're talking over 100 years ago. This was his house on the Wörthersee, where he went and where he got a kind of a jolt, a kind of creative invigoration But yet he didn't compose in that building. He composed in these little sheds. And these are called Komponistenhäuser. These are composing houses. And they just basically fit a grand piano and a little else. And he wrote the 2nd, 3rd, 5th, 6th, 7th, 9th, and 10th symphonies in these 3 sheds. So this is where the genius happened for Mahler. It happened in these little buildings set in nature. And I think, this is the last, here's a view of one of the interiors. So that was one of his pianos. And there's Mahler up in the, in one of those environments. There are 3 different environments within former Austria. And I think it was that going back and forth, that taking a hike in the mountains, that's kind of breathing in the air, taking in those views, and then coming back into these small spaces alone in a quiet environment and creating great works of art. And my sense is that when you think about the development of a resort community, there's lots of options. One option is to be extremely busy with, to be very active physically. And I think Sea Ranch represents a different kind of option. And it's along these kind of lines. A lot of the people I've met since I've been here have been former professors, architects, artists, people who want to come here, have that rapport with nature, and then come back and make something by themselves of high value. So I think that's just a couple remarks I have about what Sea Ranch might mean. Thank you.
Thank you, Mitchell. Christopher Hawthorne has been the architecture critic for the Los Angeles Times since fall 2004. Previously, he was architecture critic for Slate, a contributing editor for Metropolis magazine, and a frequent contributor to the New York Times and other publications. He served as consulting curator for the National Building Museum's groundbreaking 2005 exhibition, The Green House, New Directions in Sustainable Architecture and Design, and was co-author of the catalog. Christopher has taught at the Graduate School of Journalism at the University of California, Berkeley, and at Columbia University. Welcome, Christopher Hawthorne.
Good morning, everyone. Let me raise this a little bit. Can everybody hear me in the back? Yeah. Thank you so much, Jackie and Donlyn and everyone who helped organize this terrific event today, the members of the committee, all of the volunteers who have been so helpful. I feel very lucky to be here, to have been invited to this terrific celebration of these 50 years at Sea Ranch. And this is an image that I took with my phone on Thursday evening when I arrived of one of the Binker barns by Turnbull, the house that I'm staying in, just a 5-minute walk south of here, which encapsulates a lot of what I think we all find appealing about this place. That is this sense of connection to nature and escape. And I think what we also perhaps can find a little bit vexing or complicated about this place as a landscape that is also in opposition to and sometimes in flight from the rest of the world. And I want to talk a little bit about that today and what it means for the future direction of this place. But this is a landscape that I know fairly well. I began coming here, I think when I was in junior high, when my parents began renting houses here, and later my parents built a house here that was, I think, very much connected to the ideals of Sea Ranch, and in fact won a Sea Ranch Design Award. I could have also included, if I had gone through my family scrapbook, some picture of me at age 14 or 15, in the corner of one of these houses watching a 49ers game and ignoring, this spectacular landscape outside the window. But something about it seeped in to my consciousness, and I think it really continues to inform how I think about the relationship between architecture and place. And so I mention all of that and show this image as a way of talking about my own sense of deep connection to this landscape. I think of myself as somebody who loves architecture and loves California, and this is a place where those two things come together as seamlessly as anywhere else. So there is that sense of the house in the landscape by itself, which I showed in that first image. But I think it's important to remember, and Donlyn has already reminded us of this, that the foundational architectural documents, as you will, the kind of constitution of the place, is not just the single-family house, but also these condominiums. And I want to keep that in mind, this idea of some multifamily living here, some real efficiency in arranging residential architecture on this landscape. And not just multifamily, but also the hedgerow houses, these incredibly efficient essays in how to live on this landscape, as we've already seen. So these are examples from the very beginning of not just what works here, what respects and keeps open the landscape, but I think also stand as examples of architectural invention and experimentation. There's a kind of freshness and newness about these buildings when they were new that I want to remind us throughout my remarks to try to keep in mind as we look forward. And also their examples, I think one of the words that Donlyn used this morning was discipline, and I think that's a word we should keep in mind too, this kind of real architectural discipline in these houses that were of this scale. And here's the Eschlik house, which is one of those. I think, what is it? It's probably 1,100 square feet or something like that, if that. An incredibly efficient, compact, and complex house inside. And this is the guest house at the Heinz House, the Turnbull House that we saw yesterday. Even smaller than that. Another terrific kind of essay exercise in this kind of efficiency and discipline. Use that word again. And then also I want to keep in mind that at the beginning, it was not just the hedgerow houses and the condominium that were meant as kind of case studies, examples of these ideals and building really efficiently on this landscape, but also Oceanic itself was producing these small demonstration houses. This is one of the ones that we saw yesterday up on the hill. Again, very small, very efficient, and almost aesthetic in a certain way. I might also mention the cluster houses that Donlyn showed us some pictures of. But then inside, a kind of exuberance, as we've heard, but a kind of complexity also in these interiors, in contrast to those kind of often plain-spoken exteriors that really do match the landscape. And that's really clear in the graphics. Barbara Stoffacher-Solomon's graphics that we've seen a little bit of. This is in the women's bathroom. We sneaked in there yesterday. Again, a kind of, not just the graphics, but a kind of incredible visual complexity mixed in with that efficiency and that rigor. Even if, as this image suggests, in the lodge, those super graphics are not always treated with maybe the respect that they deserve. But they're still there, and they're peeking out at us from all little corners of Sea Ranch. And I think, let's keep it on this image, actually. I think we've seen, I won't show any images of them, but in the years since, any of us who've spent a lot of time at the Sea Ranch know that the houses have gotten bigger over the years, and there have been some that have succumbed to a kind of bloat. Particularly as I noticed first in the first years of the first .com boom, that more money was coming up here and people were coming with certain expectations about what their second home ought to look like, what kind of square footage it might include, what kind of amenities it might include, that were sometimes really at odds with those founding ideals of discipline and efficiency that we've been talking about this morning. And I think we're in another era where there's a lot of money, again, being made in San Francisco and the Bay Area, and a lot of that money is coming up here again. And so I think at this moment, at this 50th anniversary, as we look back but also look forward, I'm interested in my remarks this morning in thinking about how we might produce some new examples that are contemporary architecture that suggest some of those ideals and maybe reinvent them and carry them forward. And that's really what I'd like to talk about this morning. So I already used the phrase case study, and that, of course, for anyone who knows much about California architecture, will bring to mind the famous case study program that began right after the war in Los Angeles, sponsored by Arts and Architecture magazine, and its crusading editor, John Intenza. This is, the generation 20 years basically leading up to the creation of the Sea Ranch. So the case study program covers from about 1945 to about 1965, 64, 65. And this is probably the image that most of you think of if you close your eyes and think about the case study program. Those of you who know it, you think of this famous Julia Schulman image of the Pierre Koenig stall house. But it's not that image, actually, that I want to talk about in connection with the case study houses. There's actually a couple of other ones, including another Koenig case study house, the Bailey House, which is, again, has a kind of rigor, discipline, and efficiency that most of the case study houses had, and is an element that they shared with what was happening in the early years of the Sea Ranch. This house about 1,300 square feet by Koenig. And of course the Eames House, which is officially case study house number 8, which like a lot of the houses at Sea Ranch, Donlyn mentioned the houses that step back out of the way and allow others to have views. This is, those of you who've been to the house, it's in the Pacific Palisades on a spectacular site with the eucalyptus grove overlooking the ocean. And what the Eameses did is really push the house all the way back to the edge. Instead of planting it right on the edge of the bluff where they would have had the most dramatic view, they built the house back on one edge of the lot and kept that meadow, that eucalyptus meadow open. And it's also a very efficient exercise in architectural, let's say, rigor. The house is about 1,500 feet, in the studio, which you see at the top right, is about another 1,000 feet. And this is also, especially in Los Angeles, an iconic and intensely familiar image. But as I've been looking at some of the images this morning, I'm thinking about how much the Charles Moore interiors have in common with this. A very plain, sometimes in some ways self-effacing container for this kind of exuberance, and in this case the personal collection of Charles and Ray Eames, which included quite a bit of folk art. And that relationship between inside and outside, container and contained, is very similar, I think, in what the Eameses were doing to what Charles Moore and some of the other Sea Ranch architects were working on. This is also a house, for those of you who don't know, which was built basically with off-the-shelf parts that the Eameses sort of put together like an erector set on this meadow. And from the outside it looks, despite its color, it has that kind of industrial character, but inside you have this incredible collection and this kind of exuberance, these bursts of color and whimsy. Now, something that, in terms of this relationship between the single-family house and the multifamily project at Sea Ranch and elsewhere, it's not particularly well known that the case study houses toward the end of that 20-year run did actually produce a couple of attempts at multifamily housing. So this is a project in Phoenix by Al Beadle. Will Bruder probably knows how many units. I think it's 3 units. 3 units. And there was also a project in Newport Beach by Ed Killingsworth for a 10-unit case study project that was never built. So there was a similar tension in the case study program, despite how closely we identified now with the single-family house on the hillside, this kind of glamorous Julia Schulman photograph of what it means to be, again, like the very first image I showed, to be separate from the landscape, detached from it. There was an effort and an interest even in the case study program in some denser models and some models that were more urban, as suggested by this one. So there are a number of examples from more contemporary architectural practice that I think suggest some experiments in producing these kinds of demonstrations, these kinds of case studies. One of the best known in New York is something that PS1 and MoMA co-sponsor. It's called the Young Architects Program, and every summer they pick a young office to produce an installation in the middle of this courtyard, which is really a way to demonstrate what young architects are thinking about, give a young firm a chance to actually build something and explore some of the ideas that they're working on. This is one from a couple of years ago called Party Wall by a firm called Coda that included a number of recycled skateboard parts. And it's basically a backdrop for a series of parties. They have DJs, they have people there all summer, but it's also a highly sought after a project to get among young architects, and also often helps make the reputation of firms, young American firms who are just coming up. And I mention it as a way to think about not just the case study houses, but what the variety of contemporary approaches are to doing this kind of demonstration project in hopes of bringing that conversation back around. To Sea Ranch, the Serpentine Pavilion in London also does this every summer with well-known architects rather than emerging ones. This is the one done a couple of years ago by Su Fujimoto, the great young Tokyo architect, and another done by Sana, another Tokyo firm in that garden. And I was just there a couple of weeks ago to see the new pavilion, which is by a Chilean architect named Smiljan Radic. And in Los Angeles, there is the example of the materials and applications, which is a gallery and art practice in Silver Lake, which also gives over its courtyard in the same way to this kind of, sometimes artists, sometimes architects, sometimes the two of them working in concert. This is probably the best known of the M&A installations by a really talented LA firm called Ball and Oak Studio. This project is called Maximilian Schell. And so there are those examples out there. I think maybe a little bit more germane to the Sea Ranch example is the house that Peter Zumthor, actually this is one of two houses that Peter Zumthor designed as a vacation house for himself, not far from his office, but up at the very top of this mountain, or near the very top of it. But which is also available to rent, and it's a kind of demonstration in a way of his architectural philosophy. Here's the interior, which has something in common in its efficiency and its interest in framing the landscape, I think, with what a lot of the Sea Ranch projects that we've seen. And then a recent initiative in the UK, led by Alain de Botton, the writer whose book, The Architecture of Happiness, some of you may know, has been working with a number of leading contemporary firms to produce vacation houses that are rentals. The project is called Living Architecture. These are all houses that you can rent and spend the night in, but they're also meant, again, as demonstration projects, an opportunity for these firms to produce things that they might not otherwise find clients for. This is a house called the Balancing Barn by a firm called NVRDV from Holland. This is a project that I'm obsessed with. I haven't gone to see it yet, but I will early next year when it's finished. It's a project that I think would make Charles Moore smile. This is one of the Living Architecture houses. It's a collaboration between the recently disbanded London firm called FAT, Fashion Architecture Taste, which was sort of a one-firm postmodern revival in London for a few years. And they produced this house in collaboration with an artist called Grayson Perry. And it's meant to be a kind of gingerbread house. And I think maybe it's best appreciated from a perspective like this as it sits in the landscape. And it's whimsical in the way that the best of Charles Moore's work was whimsical. This is another house in that series, the Living Architecture series, that's nearing completion. It's called the Dune House in Suffolk by a Norwegian firm called JVA. So in closing, I want to talk about some of the younger emerging architects who I think might be enlisted to produce some new model or demonstration case study houses for the next 50 years of Sea Ranch. The first I'll mention is the LA architect Barbara Bester. This is a project nearing completion in Echo Park called Blackbirds. It's made possible by something called the Small Lot Subdivision Ordinance, which, without getting into the details, allows in Los Angeles increased level of residential density, but separate houses that are actually owned as houses rather than as condominiums. Barbara, who's a very talented architect, was really looking closely, I think, at the Haystack School, the Ed Barnes project in Maine, but also at Sea Ranch. If you go think about this project, it shows that she's been looking at this landscape and these precedents that we've been talking about this morning. This is a house that she remade for herself, also in Echo Park, which again has some I think, some echoes of Charles Moore's work in its color. And this is an interior that Barbara designed for the Beechwood Cafe, Beechwood Canyon. Again, some of that exuberance and color that you see in the early Sea Ranch project. So that's one office. One architect who I think is doing work that is complementary to the spirit, the ideals of the original Sea Ranch houses. This is another one. This is a project by another LA firm called Johnston Markley. This is a project they did for Ordos, which was a project in Mongolia that had, I think, 100 houses altogether by firms all over the world. But they have more recently have been known for winning a competition at the Manil for New Drawing Institute, beating out a pretty high-powered group, including Sana and David Chipperfield, to produce this new Center for Works on Paper, which from the outside, and I show this because it connects back to this idea of kind of self-effacing, simple geometry on the outside, hiding a kind of complexity in the interior. And in fact, if you look at this the right way, you'll see that they've, despite the fact that this looks like it has a flat roof and it has a kind of modernist vocabulary, they've smuggled a gable into the inside of the project. Again, that kind of complexity that we see going back to the original condominium projects. And the last one that I'll show is, this is a young Tokyo architect named Go Hasegawa, whose houses I was lucky enough to see a couple of years ago in Tokyo. Again, a very simple, almost platonic idea of the house, which you can see in some of the Sea Ranch projects too, on a busy Tokyo street on a very small lot, which has this remarkable interior squeezed into a very small space, and that actually has this floor that you can see right down through. That gives you a better idea of it. So my simple proposition in closing, and I say this understanding, I want to from the outset say, I say this understanding the complexities of design review and approvals at the Sea Ranch, is that someone here, whether it's the association itself or some group of architects and concerned Sea Ranchers,